So how do you value intellectual property?
It depends on what it is. If it's a patent, patents have the life of 20 years from the date of filing. So if this patent was filed in 2019 and approved today, it has a good value. Depends on the industry. If it's a new kind of rim nut that does this have a fantastic value? I would say yes. If it's an innovation in the healthcare world, it would need to be a proof of concept, be looking at the need, looking at the marketplace, who's going to be the buyer of the intellectual property or the licensees of the intellectual property. There are many, many variables. Biggest variable I had was a radiology company who were going to buy, initially going to buy an innovation. And when they found out what it was, wow, this is a global game changer. We can't afford to buy it. We want to license it, but we don't think we can afford to exclusive license it. We want exclusivity for 12 months and then go non-exclusive with rights to actually sublicense it. So it always depends on what you've got and who the audience is as to how you can actually monetize it.
And there's always the issue of raising money, and that starts from day one. And typically a startup, you're trying to validate the model and something that's scalable and repeatable, but you're constantly raising money. And part of the money usually has to do with marketing and financial metrics. How many people, how are you scaling your website, or how many new customers are you getting, and how much annual recurrent revenue are you generating? But again, the IP value is frequently ignored in the equation. Some instances by the investor, although more and more investors are pretty savvy and they're going to ask you that question, as you mentioned in your 5 things. And incidentally, other than intellectual property, because people are going to want to know, well, what are the other 4 things? So what are the other 4 things?
Number 1 is intellectual property, previously mentioned. Number 2, management. People invest in people. Number 3, audience. Who's going to monetize your innovation? Number 4, product. Now, you'll be surprised that the actual product is the 4th of 5. The reason being is if the product isn't as good as it should be, then number 2, the stellar management will make it a stellar product, not the other way around. And then number 5, barriers to entry. So if you imagine them all in a circle where 1 and 5 sit next to each other, IP is a very important barrier to entry.
Okay, so given those things, and you're trying to raise money, valuing your intellectual property. So in other words, what's the pre-money value of this company? Because that's what investors are going to want to know. So if the pre-money, if you tell me that your company is worth $1, and then you say, oh, I forgot to include the intellectual property, we think it's worth $5. So how do you measure the delta?
Let me just give you the example of a client who's not in the healthcare industry. They're actually in the oil and gas industry. They were a client of mine around about 3 years ago, and they had 2 innovations that they took international patents out on, and they wrote copyrights of the story of how to use that innovation around each patent. And so they had 3 copyrights on each patent. And from those 2 patents, the innovations inside those, there was 12 different processes that could be, I think it was like a 4 and an 8, if I remember correctly at the time, 4 from one, 8 from the other. And then, so they trademarked each and every one. This company, the trademarks alone, and this is a pre-revenue company, this company with the trademarks were valued at $1 million each. And the company itself with the patents were valued at $16 million. And the reason being that the patents were actually valued a little bit lower than the trademarks is that with trademarks, as long as you pay the renewal fee, they can go on forever. The patents expire, have a 20-year life.
So we have a question from our esteemed colleague, Anthony Chang. Anthony, do you want to unmute yourself and answer and ask the question?
Morning, Lawrence. Thanks for coming.
Good morning.
One question I get asked very often in the AI and healthcare space is how difficult it is to try to have some ownership to an algorithm, particularly in medical imaging, because as you know, companies have formed from the algorithm for medical imaging.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when you update that algorithm? Is it a constant patent filing process?
Well, number one, because it's software,
yeah.
And even the USPTO, last time I was there for my class in person in late 2019, they announced, by the way, we are now recommending for any software that you don't file a patent, you file a copyright. Things are changing so quickly.
Right.
When you file a patent, it's a full patent, it's invisible for 18 months. It might be another 18 months by the time the decision is made. How many times have you updated the software?
Yeah.
You file copyrights, that's the story.
And how
So what happens?
Is it? Oh, sorry.
But I think,
yeah.
you know, part of the question, I'm sorry, Anthony, go ahead and follow up.
I was just going to say that sometimes parts of the algorithm is already open source and it's out there. What
True.
happens with that?
Well, effectively, you cannot include that in your copyright. And because it belongs to effectively somebody else, it's open source out there for everybody to use. A good intellectual property attorney who would be able to and specializing in AI and the copyrights of AI would be able to determine by the amount of what you're using that's open source and what's unique to you.
Right.
Without knowing those specifics, it's hard to answer. However, your trusted IP attorney will, once you actually tell them exactly what you have, then and what you're using from another source, then that will be